So today I'm going to talk about something different though. I'm going to talk about water. We all know that we can't live more than a few days without water to drink. This is fundamental to most life on our planet. But how much water or how much value do we really put on that water? And how much water do we really use? Here's an example. It takes about 11,000 liters of water to produce one pair of blue jeans. Even the cup of coffee I drank this morning took about 140 liters of water. All that extra water is used for the agricultural production of the product, refining it, and delivering it to the marketplace. So water and these other natural substances and resources that we all use are something called ecosystem services, or a product of ecosystem services. Now, right now on planet Earth, there are about 7 billion people. By 2050, there will be 9 billion people. The World Economic Forum issues a global risk report every year, and in this survey of 900 government leaders in private sector and leaders in academia, water crises were ranked at the top as the top risk factor. We can see why, with 2 billion more people being added to the world in the coming years. That's the equivalent of China and India combined being added to our current load on ecosystem services. So what are ecosystem services? These are where we get all the natural products that we use, all the things that we need from our environment. So my talk really is not so much about water, but about all of these ecosystem services. Now, I didn't grow up thinking about ecosystem services, but I did grow up in a big city, Philadelphia, in the US. I had a cousin who lived outside the city. I didn't know much about nature, and he used to take me hiking. He was an older cousin, and he loved birds, and I can remember many a hike in the woods where he was saying, "Stop, look at that bird." And I was a young kid. I was kind of impatient, but eventually I grew to understand his fascination with nature, and I remember many a cold night in the sleeping bag shivering while he talked about ecosystems and how birds and animals interacted with the environment. So this is how I got my start in the sciences. So many ecosystem services come from something called a watershed. What exactly is a watershed? It's an area of land into which all the rain that falls and all this water that flows out can be measured at a single point or an outlet, usually a stream or a river. And ecosystem services from watersheds cover a variety, or represent a variety of things. I mentioned water. We also get forest products and wood. We get soil fertility from which we grow our crops. We also get things called biodiversity and carbon sequestration, which I'll talk about in a minute. One classic example, probably one of the best examples in the world for a set of ecosystem services is right here in Panama with the Panama Canal watershed. We get a variety of services from that. One of them is income. Something on the order of $2 billion a year is generated by ships passing through the canal, and about half of that money comes back to the general fund, to the government and the people of Panama. We also get drinking water. More than half of the drinking water that we all consume in the entire country of Panama comes from the canal watershed. This is high quality water. We also get electricity. These lights are being powered by electricity produced, almost half of which is produced by hydroelectric energy in the canal watershed. So this is one of the best examples of where we get a variety of very valuable ecosystem services for this country. And you could argue that without that economic activity, Panama might not have arisen to the powerful role it plays in this region now as a finance and capital for Central America and the region. These things are threatened, though, by natural and human processes. For example, once every 15 years on average, there's a lack of rainfall sufficient in Panama to drive the canal. So there's so little rainfall that lake levels fall and shipping has to be lightened. So we lose money from ships coming through the canal. They don't pay the full freight because they're not shipping as much through. We also suffer in our water supply and hydroelectric energy production, like just last spring, some of you may remember. These things are controlled by something called a lineal cycle, to a large part, floods and droughts both, but they're also affected over the longer term by climate change. So we know that droughts and floods in the future will be more frequent and more intense under these changing climates that are predicted. Floods and droughts are mitigated to some degree by forested watersheds, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So how does it happen? The forest can act like a sponge. A forested watershed has high biodiversity in the soils. So if you look at that picture, you'll see lots of passageways into the soil under forest. These are created by tree root systems, burrowing organisms like ants, termites, earthworms, rodents. All of these processes create pathways through the soil through which rain passes into the soil and replenishes groundwater. The same setting in pasture has a much lower biodiversity. Trampling of the soils, removal of trees removes these passageways. So we lose a lot of the capacity that a forest has to mitigate floods and to retain water that can be used later in droughts. So how exactly does this work? Smithsonian scientists, in collaboration with those from the US Geological Survey and university partners, have compared two watersheds in the canal watershed. And they found two sites where the areas of the watersheds are about the same. One's in forest, one's not. It's been largely deforested, mostly in pasture. The watersheds have about the same area, same square kilometers, or number of hectares, same hill slope gradients, very similar soil types, so they can be compared fairly directly, and we're measuring stream flow from both of those watersheds. So if you look at this plot, you'll see two different lines, a red one and a green one, red for deforested watershed and yellow for the forested watershed. And we compare water flow out of these two watersheds, what we call runoff, across an annual cycle. And you see a couple things right away. First of all, during the rainy season, there's more water coming out of that watershed. So if you're an economist and you're thinking only about the ecosystem service of water, nothing else, you'll say, well, great, let's get rid of the forest and we'll capture all that extra water, and if we have a sufficient, large enough reservoir downstream, we can capture it and retain it. But there's a downside. That extra runoff also causes soil erosion. It can cause landslides. And that degrades water quality downstream from the extra sediment moving into the reservoir or into the canal where it has to be dredged. We also see another negative. If you look at the dry season, you'll see that the deforested watershed has less runoff. That's because more of it left during the wet season. It's not retained in groundwater to keep streams flowing during the dry season. Look now at the yellow line, and you can see what happens in a forested watershed. So there's less water running off. It's retained in the soil through all those passageways that I described and getting down into groundwater. And so the economist who's looking only at water might say, well, see, you're wasting the effort. All those trees are transpiring and evaporating water and we're not getting as much. However, we get some payback. Look at the wet season, at the dry season, and you can see some of that water that was retained by the forest during the wet season is now coming available during the dry season. That's what's feeding the streams during the dry season. So we see a much more balanced picture there between these two watersheds when we look at that forested watershed. So these are some valuable ecosystem services that we get from forest compared to a deforested watershed. I mentioned that ecosystem services are mitigations of hazards. Floods and droughts may be more frequent in the future. We've already seen now how forested watersheds can reduce some of that runoff. So that means they can reduce some of the peak discharge, the high discharges during floods. There are other ecosystem services also that come not just from watersheds but from other natural environments related to hazards. For example, coral reefs offshore help mitigate or prevent battering waves that come on shore during storms. They reduce erosion from those storms. Wetlands, mangroves, also reduce the same hazards. They provide a buffer zone in coastal areas and prevent those big storm waves from damaging coastal infrastructure and environments. The President of Panama just signed an important bill protecting wetlands here in Panama, so that's an important step for protecting these resources. Let's come back to that photo. This is a storm from early December 2010. known as La Purisima, for the date that it occurred early in December. I'm sure many of you remember this storm. The flow from that storm down the Chagres River was measured at 235 million cubic meters of water. That's a lot of water. That's 235 million tons of water. The dam floodgates, all the canal locks were wide open to let all of that water, or as much as possible, through as fast as possible for 17 hours straight. Engineers tell us that during that storm, the systems, the lock gates, the dam floodgates, were at their design limits. What does this mean? It means that had there been much more water flowing through, which would have been the case had had more of the watershed been deforested, they might well have failed. This would have been a huge disaster, not only for Panama, but for global shipping. I mentioned another ecosystem service, something called carbon sequestration. Why is that important, and what does it mean? Earlier I talked about climate change. Each time we burn a gallon of gas in our car, we emit 20 pounds of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. On average, that's about 7 to 10 tons of carbon dioxide per year per vehicle around the world. We've been doing this for a while. Of course, we didn't start with gasoline. We started with coal and oil back at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But the net effect is that we're increasing carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, and we are warming our planet. Now, forests can mitigate some of that effect. How? Through something we call carbon sequestration. It's basically the accumulation of carbon in trees. So every time we allow a tree in a forest to grow, we're accumulating carbon. Why is that? Because trees use that CO2 to build wood on their trunks. And so here's a plot showing you how trees increase carbon with time over a space of decades. And one of the things that our Smithsonian scientists are studying is how they do this not only in primary forests, those that have been undisturbed, but also in secondary forests. And I'll come back to that in a minute. I talked about biodiversity earlier, and soil fauna, the animals in soil, are an important piece of that. But what are some other examples? Well, ecotourism. We know that here in Panama and in the regions, the countries in the region, ecotourism is a growing industry, bringing a lot of economic value into the country and into those of our neighbors. But what are some other examples? Well, here's a really curious one. Just last year, Smithsonian scientists studied and published the results of fungus that grows on the hair of sloths here in Panama. They were able to isolate 80 different fungus types that grow on the hair of these animals. You would say, well, what's so curious about that? Why is that important? Well, it turns out one of those fungal types shows bioactivity against the malarial parasite. Another one shows bioactivity against gram-negative bacteria. Why is that important? It's extremely important because of our suite of antibiotics that we currently use in modern medicine are slowly becoming less effective as more and more diseases are showing resistance to these antibiotics. Here's another fascinating one. There's a fungal type on the hair of a sloth that shows effective bioactivity against the human breast cancer cell. Breast cancer cell. This is a brand new finding, and it's just one example of a suite of important biodiversity-related results of this work. Now, it's important to note that since 1980, about half of all new medicines developed around the world came from natural substances. So it's critically important that we maintain this type of diversity. One more example, pollination by bees. In the United States alone, $15 to $20 billion a year in crop production, mostly fruit, some vegetables, nuts, citrus, comes from, or it depends on pollination by bees. Here in Panama, many of our citrus crops are dependent on bee pollination. So also is enhanced coffee production, and I can't live without that, so I don't know about you. The importance of bee pollination is global, but they can't live without forested areas in or near crop areas because the bees need that environment. So I've been talking about a number of different uses, and I mentioned that the population will be increasing by about 2 billion by the middle of the century. All of that extra population means increased food production, which means that virtually all arable land, all cultivable land will have to go to crop production. This means that all of our wood products and our forest products will have to shift, or will be shifted by economic forces, to less fertile soils. So they'll be on soils that have been degraded or eroded, otherwise have lost their nutrients. So one of the things that we're doing as part of this Smithsonian study of watersheds is to look at what type of trees grow on these marginal soils. Trees of high value that are endemic to Panama. Trees that will grow well in this type of soil, which will therefore provide multiple services. One is they mitigate or prevent soil erosion on these surfaces, but they also provide a potential market for small landowners, for big forestry companies to harvest these woods that are and trees that would grow otherwise or that wouldn't be growing on these degraded soils. We call this smart reforestation. So these are a set of examples of how these ecosystem services are interlinked and why they're vital for our future. I can't really tell you how much that cup of coffee costs truly in terms of the 140 liters that were required to create it, but we can say that with strong peer-reviewed science that informing policy decisions made by conservationists, by government policymakers, and by landowners themselves, we can help guarantee a sustainable future in which we all live a better life. Thank you very much.